This is Bucky Wild, and welcome to One Step Past. The first comic strip, The Little Bears, 1893. It was created by Jimmy Swinnerton, and it ran from 1893 to 97. It was the first newspaper cartoon with recurring characters, the recurring characters being the Bears. Now, some people like to say that Hogan's Alley, which is later known as The Yellow Kid, was the first true comic strip in 1895. It really wasn't. It's just better remembered. A lot of the things that made a comic strip were actually established just a bit earlier than The Yellow Kid with Jimmy Swinnerton's The Little Bears. Swinnerton himself, he went on to have a very good career in comics, and he had other successes like Mr. Jack, which was based on a little tiger, and Little Jimmy. If you're into old comic strips, he is worth checking out. The first true comic book, Famous Funnies number 1, 1934. The reason that I say true in the first place like that is there were so many different precursors to comic books. Everybody likes to lay claim as this is the first comic book, that's the first comic book. This was the actual first comic book as we know them. It was published independently of a newspaper for the very first time. Nothing else like that had been quite done. So it was its own separate magazine. It was released in May of 1934, although the cover date says July, and it was published by Eastern Color Printing. The first comic strip superhero, Mandrake the Magician, 1934. Mandrake the Magician, he was the first superhero of comics, period. A lot of people like to argue the point, who's the first superhero, or was he really a superhero? Mandrake the Magician definitely was the very first superhero of comics, period, and the first one to appear in comic strips. He was created by Lee Falk, who also created the famous superhero The Phantom just 2 years later. The strip debuted on June 11th of 1934. Mandrake the Magician, he's a very interesting character. He actually was a stage magician, and that's how he made his fame and fortune. He was an entertaining magician. However, he actually did have great magic powers, especially in hypnotism. He had a sidekick with the strongman Lothar. He had a secret base of operations. And he fought strange enemies that weren't just typical Earthlings. They weren't just the gangsters and Nazis that a lot of other characters fought in media at the time. He fought things like aliens and monsters, and sometimes he did fight ordinary people too. The first comic book superhero, The Clock, 1936. He first appeared in Funny Picture Stories number 1, November 1936. He was first published by Centaur Publications, and then he got picked up later on by other publishers. He was the first masked hero in comic books. And he also was an inspiration for other characters to come. He was, especially in his later incarnation, he was definitely an inspiration for Will Eisner's The Spirit. The Clock, he seems to borrow some ideas from Mandrake a little bit. He was a hypnotist. He had a secret underground lair. He liked to use gadgets, much in the way that, Mandrake used technology too. But he used gadgets that would later on just become a staple of comic book heroes. His costume wasn't much of a costume. He wore a 3-piece suit. He had a handkerchief mask. It wasn't anything too impressive by today's standards, especially with a name like The Clock. You would think that he would have more of a clock-like costume, but he doesn't. He looks rather ordinary. Later on, his handkerchief mask would be styled a little bit more into a domino-style mask with little eye holes in it. He left calling cards with a clock face as his symbol, telling the reader the clock has struck. And he was revealed later on to be a wealthy member of high society. And that also kind of established the fact that a lot of superheroes were wealthy or well-to-do, or they had some higher public standing. They weren't just common middle-class people. They were usually very wealthy people in order to be able to do the things that they do anyway. The Clock, unlike Mandrake the Magician, he mostly just fought Nazis and gangsters and ordinary bad guys. He rarely fought any super-powered sort of creatures or anything like that. Where Mandrake, he was still around. I mean, His Mandrake's comic strip only ended in 2013, but he just hasn't been very popular for a number of decades. The Clock's run was very short in comics. He's almost an entirely forgotten character. Thank you very much for watching, and if you like what you've seen, subscribe. I never run out of things to talk about.